The thing about the Soprano family is that nobody in it ever actually escapes anything. They just get better at pretending they have. Start with Livia, whatever compassionate reading you want to give her. Undiagnosed depression, a husband who checked out, a life she never chose. The fact remains that she raised a son by making him responsible for her pain. Every slight became a wound only Tony could soothe, or was accused of causing. Poor you wasn't sarcasm from her. Not really. It was contempt for the very idea that anyone's feelings mattered, including her own. And her cruelty wasn't just verbal, wasn't just atmosphere. It had a body count attached to it. When Tony finally puts her in Green Grove, Livia doesn't just complain about it. She sits with Junior, and in that flat, bored voice, tells him it might have been better if Tony had simply never existed. That's the line to sit with. Not anger, not even real malice on the surface. Just a mother musing out loud that the world would be tidier without her son in it, right before Junior tries to have him killed. Tony absorbs all of it, not consciously. He'd never frame it that way. He barely has the language for it even in Melfi's office. But structurally, in the way he runs his house. Watch the Whitecaps fight with Carmilla. Watch how the argument stops being about words the second he puts his fist through the wall next to her head. That's not a man losing control. That's Livia's fingerprint, replayed. The instant he feels exposed, cornered, actually vulnerable, he reaches for something physical and frightening instead of sitting in the feeling. Then there's Johnny Boy, who gets treated almost like an afterthought in a lot of casual analysis, but he's just as important. Go back to the flashback in Down Neck. Young Tony standing in Satrial's, watching his father calmly chop off a man's finger over a debt, and nobody in the room treating it as anything other than business. That's not just a violent memory. That's Tony being handed a value system in real time. Respect equals fear. Manhood equals violence deployed correctly, without hesitation, without guilt. So by the time we get to Tony as a father, he's carrying two contradictory inheritances. Livia's emotional weaponization, Johnny's code of masculine dominance, and he reproduces the environment, not the specific abuses, but the atmosphere. Meadow and AJ grow up in a house where love is real, genuinely real, but it's tangled up with fear, unpredictability, secrecy. Meadow processes it by becoming hyper-competent, hyper-controlled, the one who can articulate the criminal enterprise better than anyone else in the house, and who still ends up dating a man who reminds her of her father and eyeing a career in criminal defense law that would let her protect people like Tony for a living. She thinks she's escaping by understanding. She's actually just found a more sophisticated way to stay tethered. AJ is the more devastating case, because he doesn't have Meadow's defenses. And his damage isn't abstract. It has a name and a source. Go back to Livia's philosophy, the one she hands down like scripture. That life is all a big nothing. That people are duplicitous. That nothing is worth the trouble. Tony spent years learning to armor himself against that nihilism. Badly, imperfectly. But he had decades to build some kind of defense. AJ doesn't. He absorbs Livia's worldview secondhand, filtered through Tony's own depressive episodes. Through a household where doom is just the ambient weather. And it lands in him, with none of the insulation his father developed. But it's not only the words that get passed down, it's the exposure. AJ doesn't grow up hearing about violence the way Tony did, through half-understood stories and reputation. He grows up inside its aftermath. He's there when Junior, in the fog of dementia, shoots his own father. And he's the one who has to process an uncle turning a gun on his dad in the kitchen. His response isn't grief processed like a normal teenager's. It's a fixation on getting a gun himself, on the idea that he needs to be the one to retaliate. To protect the family the way he's watched the men around him handle things his whole life. That's not a kid inventing violence out of nowhere. That's a kid patterned, matching to the only language of crisis he's ever been shown. Even his friendships absorb it. The drift toward volatility, the quickness to escalate, the sense that conflict gets resolved with force rather than talked through. All of it lifted straight from the adult world he was never supposed to be paying attention to, but always was. So when AJ finally breaks, the panic attacks, and later the attempt on his own life in the pool. A direct, literal echo of his grandmother's bleakest thinking taken to its final conclusion. That's not a random psychiatric event happening to occur in this particular family. That's the putrefied gene thesis colliding head-on with plain environmental transmission. Nobody sat AJ down and explained why his father disappears for days, why men flinch around him, why panic seems to run in the family like a bad heart, why a gun ends up pointed at his father in his own kitchen. He just absorbed the dread and the violence both, without ever getting the context, and dread without context curdles into something closer to Livia's own void. Tony survives his inheritance by weaponizing it. AJ nearly doesn't survive his at all. But the clearest proof that this damage spreads to anyone treated like a son is Christopher. Tony genuinely loves him in whatever broken way he's capable of loving anyone, and that's exactly the problem. He grooms Christopher into the same impossible standard Johnny Boy handed him. Don't feel it, don't show it, drink it down, or shoot it down. Christopher's addiction isn't just personal weakness. It's what happens to someone told his entire adult life that pain is something you bury, not something you treat. And when Christopher finally relapses behind the wheel, when he's bleeding out in a wrecked car with his infant daughter's car seat empty beside him, Tony doesn't get him help. He looks at him, calculates what he's worth alive versus what he threatens to the family, to his own sobriety, to his own future, and pinches his nose shut. The surrogate son destroyed by the same father-shaped hand that raised him. Here's where the show does something almost unbearably cruel in its honesty. Tony doesn't spiral into guilt after this. He goes to Vegas. And it's worth being precise about the order of events here, because it changes the entire meaning of what follows. This isn't a man processing grief. This is a man escaping a wake he doesn't want to sit through, flying west to privately celebrate that a problem has been solved. High on peyote in the desert, watching the sun come up, he screams, "I get it," at the sky, and it plays for a second, like enlightenment. It isn't. He's not having a breakthrough about his own damage. He's having a breakthrough about permission. Some drug-addled cosmic confirmation that killing Christopher was fine, natural, even necessary. That the universe itself is telling him he did the right thing. He flies home. He doesn't grieve. He doesn't confess. He doesn't change. The epiphany was real, or real enough to him, and that's the horror of it. He uses the desert to give himself cosmic absolution. But back in reality, he relies on a different kind of excuse. And that gets at the mechanism underneath everything. The thing that lets Tony keep going year after year without collapsing under what he understands about himself. It's the putrefied gene. Listen to how he talks to Janice about their family. The conversations about Uncle Urkel, tucked away and hidden because he was different. The offhand acknowledgement that Sopranos have been having panic attacks and nervous breakdowns for generations before anyone had a clinical word for it. Tony finds this almost comforting. If the depression, the rage, the anxiety are all just biology, a curse passed down in the blood, no more his fault than the shape of his hands, then he's not responsible for interrupting it. He's just the latest carrier. That reframe is the most efficient defense mechanism in the entire series, because it lets him sit in Melfi's office, describe the whole inherited machine in devastating detail, and still walk out unchanged. The putrefied gene isn't a diagnosis. It's an alibi. That's the real horror of the ending, if you think about it in these terms. It's not about who did or didn't get shot in a diner. It's that the show spends 6 seasons showing you a system of inherited damage, biological excuse, and environmental repetition working together, and then declines to show you it ever stopping. Christopher didn't choose to be adopted into a family that would eventually kill him for becoming exactly what it made him. Nobody in this family opted in. They just got pulled into a current that's been running since long before any of them existed. And the show's whole thesis is that awareness alone, even a peyote-fueled scream of "I get it," isn't enlightenment. Sometimes it's just the sound of a man giving himself permission to stay exactly the same. I want to end on this. The show never punishes Tony for being unable to change, and it never lets him off the hook either. It just watches, coldly, patiently, the way trauma actually operates in real families, generation after generation, dressed up differently each time but running the same script underneath.